Is the COVID-19 crisis in South Africa getting out of control? The country currently has over 500,000 cases, including recoveries, making it the highest on the African continent and the fifth highest in the world. And the WHO is intervening. 17 experts from the World Health Organization land in the country this evening. We'll tell you more about that later on. Also coming up, an exclusive sit-down with Miss Universe Zozibini Tunzi and UN Women Executive Director Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. Good evening, I'm Aldrin Simpier, and this is African Perspective. There should be no bystanders in the fight to achieve gender equality. This is something everyone should be involved in. That's the message to emerge from the intergenerational conversation by two prominent South African women as we move towards Women's Day in this country this Sunday, August the 9th. Moderated by SABC's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, the Executive Director of UN Women and the reigning Miss Universe, Zozibini Tunzi, shared their views on this year's theme, Generation Equality, realizing women's rights for an equal future. Enjoy.
Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka and Zozibini Tunzi, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thank you so much for having
me. Thank you.
Executive Director, I think I'll start with you. The theme of Women's Day in South Africa aligns itself with global efforts to achieve gender equality by the 2030 deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals. Generation equality, realizing women's rights for an equal future. What does that really mean to someone like yourself and where you are sitting and in the South African context, given this deadline that looms not too far away?
You know, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sherwin, for having us. The deadline is looming. And the situation is much more complicated than it was a few months ago even. The theme is picking up on the fact that we've had 25 years of implementing what was agreed in Beijing. There are many unfulfilled promises from this 25-year journey. And we are saying between 2020 and 2030, but I'm focusing on 2025 because if we stretch it too long, we may walk slow. We need to see significant change by this generation, which we are dubbing generation equality. We are saying that this is a generation of Zozi's age group and those that come after her. My generation, your generation, Sherwin, because you and me are not in the same generation, and the generation before me. So all of us who are working together at this point, concerned about issues of equality, we are generation equality. And one of our responsibility is to realize equal rights for women and men.
So Zozibini Tunzi, let me bring you in. You represent this different generation in this discussion, born in 1993, less than 2 years before the first Women's Day was commemorated in South Africa. How does this day resonate with someone like yourself and perhaps more broadly with your generation?
I think for my generation, it's just us recognizing that there's a legacy that was left for us. Whenever I think about the women of 1956 and them marching to the union buildings to fight for this equality that we speak of today, they started that fire, they started that spark. And I think it's for us, the generation of today, to pick up that baton and to say, look, they've run their race, they did what they can. And so now, it's our responsibility to pick up that baton and see what we can do as our generation in our time, to continue the amazing work that they started. And so that's what this means to me. It's literally picking up a baton, doing my job on my time here and making sure that I pass it on, like you said, to the future generations that are coming so that it can be something that keeps on going.
I'm glad you mentioned that historic march in the 50s to the union buildings. Edie, this day was, of course, born out of that historic march against past laws. But women's marches, you'll agree, in the 21st century tend to focus overwhelmingly on the fight against femicide, against violent abuse, often murder of women at the hands of men. Why is South Africa such a violent society despite all the efforts over the last 2 decades that have gone into addressing this issue?
I cannot claim, Sherwin, to have all the answers about why we are such a violent society, but there's definitely some things that we can do much better as South Africa and the world. If I think of the women who marched to union buildings, the kind of violence that we're talking about now was not high on the agenda. At the very least, it was not visible. We have passed laws, we have mobilized women, we have given women courage for some of these things to come up. But notwithstanding that these things come up, we are not seeing the perpetrators being brought to book to the extent that you expect them to be brought to book. So this day for Zozi's generation, still for my generation, for the younger generation, and for men and women, I have to also emphasize this is important because this battle is not won. We have to win this battle with law enforcement taking full responsibility. Killing of women is not a lover's tiff. This is a crime. This is murder. It has to be treated like all murder. There's always a kind of a soft approach that expects more social workers than hardcore investigators to investigate these crimes against women. We have to change gear and make sure that just as we have said, domestic violence is not a private family matter. It is a crime against a human being. All other crimes against women have to be put at that level. The issues of relating to violence against women as passion of crime, as a crime of passion, there's no passion there. It is just murder, and we really need to make sure that these murderers are dealt with whatever the law can bring to the fore to push back, as well as to bring the perpetrators to book. We are not seeing enough perpetrators being brought to book.
You know, I had a discussion a few years ago with a female friend of mine over dinner, and I asked her, what is the biggest thing that you fear as a woman? And she told me that it's being attacked by a man. And that really helped me to understand as a man, you know, that women's rights for an equal future, and this is the theme, right, for this equal future, in large part depends on what men do next.
Yeah.
So my question to both of you, and perhaps we can start with you, Zozi, is what are your expectations of what men are required to do now, given the context that I've just laid out for you?
I think, like Mama said before, whenever we look at women issues, we shouldn't look at them as though they are like a family, thing. It is law that should be taken, to place. And also, women abuse and gender-based violence is not just a woman's fight. It should be something that everyone should be involved in because it involves everyone. And so I think we need to really start having these conversations between men and women. And it's interesting that you speak about a conversation you had with your friend, because a couple of days ago, if not 2 days ago, I was having this exact conversation on social media, where somebody was mentioning, if only women could buy their own drinks at the club, then maybe it would result to less results of them being spiked or, being attacked on their way home. And my conversation is, this is the wrong conversation to be having. For so many years, we've been having a conversation of teaching women how to defend themselves, of teaching women how to not get into those situations, when the real issue is there shouldn't be a situation in the first place. And so the conversation really needs to shift from teaching women to protect themselves to teaching men and young boys consent, teaching men and young boys the right things to be and the right way to be. And so I think that's the shift that needs to start happening, and it needs to start at a very, very young age. Men speaking to young boys, or maybe even teaching it at schools. That should be something that's within the curriculum. And I think that's how we might be able to, move forward, have the right conversations.
Edie, I want you to jump in here. You know, I've written down here to ensure a safer environment in which women can thrive. In many ways, really is in men's hands here, right? It's about men's responsibility. It's about stopping the heckling when a woman walks down the street. It's the small things that count when men correct bad behavior within their own tribe. That can go a long way, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, there should be no bystanders here. I don't have...
No bystanders here. Let's repeat that.
Yes, no, there should be no bystanders here. A good man is not a good man if he does not participate in fighting against bad men. There should be no man who tolerates a locker room talk that denigrates women. It should not be possible for good men to live in an environment where a friend, a relative is an abuser and they don't take action to intervene, to correct the situation, to support the women. Women also are survivors. I also want to make sure that we don't portray women as helpless victims. They take a lot of suffering. Their rights are significantly violated. And, you know, some of these wounds never heal. The invisible wounds are the hardest to heal. So they live with this situation and just carry on with life, sometimes as if they are not carrying this pain. So we actually need everybody to make sure that women are not put in this situation. And when men do this, they should not expect medals and praise, because we shouldn't be praising fishes for swimming. Fighting for equality, fighting for a humane society is everyone's responsibility. So men in South Africa and everywhere in the world need to step up for themselves, because it's important for them to be a good man. Mm-hmm. A good man is a man who's not a bystander, let alone a man who assaults a woman and a child.
Let me shift focus just slightly here. You know, the world most recently was caught up in a groundswell of protest in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in the United States, placing the issue of racial justice front and center. Can we draw a line, and I'll start with you, Executive Director, can we draw a line between the struggle for racial justice and the struggle for gender equality?
Well, intersectionality has never been more important than now, when we're beginning to see a response to racial inequality. I really want to make it very clear that racial and gender inequality must not be separated. Otherwise, we delay in the progress we should be making. Women of color should not end up losing again in this momentum about race. When a company says they are going to be employing X percentage of Black people as a way of correcting the situation, they must say men and women, because it is actually very easy to forget about women when this happens. We don't want to have a situation where Black men become comfortable in these places and they themselves find that they're actually not pulling together and positioning Black women. That is why the campaign about saying her name within the Black Lives Matter movement is so important, because these two are intertwined. We need to know about both the men and the women who are victims of police brutality.
So Zozibini, let's bring you in, and I want you also to touch on this idea, this line between seeking racial justice and also seeking gender equality. I want you to talk about your experiences as a young Black woman that is essentially confronting both.
Sherwin, I once read somewhere, I think somebody said being a Black woman is like being Black twice. And, it struck a chord. It means absolutely everything. Like Mama said, now we're speaking of Brianna and, say her name, because women tend to be in the shadows sometimes when we're fighting this, and people do forget about them. And so, as a young Black woman myself, I feel they do go hand in hand. You can't have one conversation without the other. And so definitely, it's things that are not exclusive to each other. I've seen it happening. I've experienced it. I've seen other people experience it too, women being left out once again. And so, like Mama said, if we are going to be speaking about race and equality, then we should be bringing in, gender equality as well into the conversation.
But your generation, Zozi, is a very impatient generation. Do you see the level of impatience when we talk about this, the question of gender equality? Can you stir up some impatience among your peers?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely right. You see it on social media today. We are not a generation that sits down and doesn't say anything. So I think we're trying as much as we can. I mean, when I look outside into the streets of New York, people are still marching, and it's young people. It's young blood that's out there in the streets. They're not as scared anymore of speaking out. And so I think that's a great thing for the youth to have, because, young people are, in essence, the future. And absolutely, I love to be a part of it. I love to stir the pot. And as we young people say, it's called shaking the tables. And we will continue, shaking the tables until we see change happening.
Yeah, the unfortunate. Sorry, Edie, carry on.
So also, if I may say, what is refreshing also about this generation is their radical impatience, and the fact that they don't expect to be led. In fact, they are not waiting to take the baton. They have taken it already. They are wasting no time. They are showing their true colors. Activists these days start at the age of 10 and 11, and they tackle really deep issues, from climate to poverty to ending child marriage. And this is not talent and concern that they bring with them that should be wasted. So this impatience that we see is a blessing, I have to say, for the movement. And also the last thing I would also like to say is that when Black women are fighting as women of color and women, they also need to speak for themselves. We want liberation for all women in all their diversity, their sexuality, their races, but no one must claim to speak for women of color. It is important that women of color are able to speak from themselves about their issues, because women of color are not waiting to be serviced and to be served. They want to save themselves, and our solidarity is about being together, but it's not about us being replaced as leaders of our own struggle.
Fair enough. We hear you. So let me stay with you, Executive Director. We often talk about how COVID-19 has amplified inequalities. And again, this raises questions about women of color in particular, which means women and girls who are vulnerable already in our society then tend to suffer disproportionately compared to men during these difficult times. We've seen escalation in GBV in the home, for instance, lack of access to technology and education, increased unpaid childcare responsibilities for women. So what does building back better look like? This is a phrase we hear from you and officials from the top down. You're up there in the Secretariat. What does building back better look like?
Building back better means we now bring the new normal, which has to be different from the status quo that has been there before COVID. The status quo we're battling against before COVID, because all its inequalities and the suffering it causes has been exposed so vividly for everybody. Building back better is actually going back and fixing the things that we should have fixed in the first place. Practically, it means that we have to address the issue of water and sanitation in families and schools. For women and girls, the absence of those two services can be a game changer in their own lives. And we must not do interim, makeshift interventions that will not exist after COVID. Building back better means we solve the problems for the long term. As far as gender-based violence is concerned, the many gaps that we have identified, and we'll be issuing, the Secretary General will be issuing another call on the gaps we have identified as we have been implementing and responding to COVID. Building back better means we close those gaps and we do this for the rest of their life. It means we fix the digital divide between countries, within countries, and between men and women. So it means we get a second check. It's almost like the RDP times, Sherwin, when we were starting from the scratch to put into place what we wanted the new South Africa to be. But this is even more severe than that time of RDP because of the number of jobs that we are losing and the fact that people are actually sick and dying. So there's an emergency that we're also dealing with.
But we don't want poor infrastructure and leaks in the roof like some of those RDP houses. We definitely don't want that in the future. Zozi, let me bring you in here. Your answer in the Miss Universe finale, that we should teach young girls leadership and the importance of taking up space in society. What can you say about just how urgent that need is for leadership, for women to take up space in society, given the context we've just been talking about?
Absolutely urgent. It has been for a while now. And I think it's time, to start implementing those things. It's so interesting. I was actually listening to a clip again this morning, and somebody, I forgot the name, but they were speaking about how we've had to wait and wait for such a long time for change to happen. And I love that we're speaking about the youth in our generation, because now they're no longer asking, how long do we have to wait? They're saying we're done waiting. When Mama said we're very radical. And so the question has changed now into more action. And so it's very important. It's very timely and relevant to this time to start seeing change happen. Somebody said we should stop looking at 2020 as the unfortunate year, but the year that came and revealed so many things and taught us so many things. And so in all the works that have been revealed, I'm hoping that more space is opening up for women, more space is opening up for young girls to actually be able to find themselves in those positions of leadership, because now we really need to start closing that gap that has been so evidently revealed to us during this time.
But in many ways, Zozi, patriarchy has to get out of the way for that to happen, right?
Absolutely. For that to happen, we have to go and dismantle every system of patriarchy that has been built, because that seems to be the ongoing theme of everything in the world, everything built on patriarchal systems. And we cannot have a further conversation before we can go there and start dismantling those systems.
Edie, in the South African context, are you beginning to see the cracks in the patriarchy armor? I mean, this is something we've been knocking away at in our conversations, in your work for years now. Are you beginning to see this wall crumble?
The crack is not big enough, but I do want to commend the men who are stepping up, who are outliers. We actually need this to be a mainstream view. That's when we begin to change. If you think about apartheid became an issue that was dealt with by everybody because it had reached a point where it was not viable for anyone. No one credible wanted to be associated with apartheid everywhere in the world. We don't have that situation yet. As far as gender is concerned. At some point, I think you may remember, maybe Zozi was too young. Everybody did not know, had nothing to do. Apartheid became an orphan. There was a time after 1994 where you couldn't find people who were responsible and supported apartheid. This is what we need to create about gender equality. But I also want to say, for Zozi's generation and for Zozi herself, in the industry that is in, where people actually think that people are mostly interested in the bling, it is refreshing to see that now we actually have young women who use the platform to amplify the issues that are difficult for other people to amplify. They actually show that for this issue, everybody has to roll out their sleeves, and there's space, whatever angle you get, you just take it and run with it, the way she has been able to do, and others in sports, etc., have been able to do. And for that, I really am just so proud to see that we have this generation that is so focused on the issues.
Final question before we wrap. I want to stay with the Executive Director just for a minute. This September, of course, marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action, something you touched on at the beginning of this conversation, which is essentially the most comprehensive plan to achieve global legal equality for women and girls adopted by UN member states in 1995. What needs to happen for us to reinvigorate that document 25 years later? Because I know we have not implemented as we should.
Yes, for one, we need to highlight the gaps, and we have been doing that. And we have identified what needs to be done to close the gap. That is what generation equality is about. We do not want to reopen the document. We don't want to risk having to renegotiate it because the world has changed. It's not safe to renegotiate agreements that you already have, but you can enhance them. And that is what generation equality is about. Economic justice is still an issue. Of course, gender-based violence is still an issue. Leadership and participation of women is still an issue. And of course, we've got new issues. We have environment, which we have to highlight and tackle much better, and the way it impacts on women. We have technology, which is also critical for women. And now we are also having the rights that, at least in a country like South Africa, we thought that we had won the sexual and reproductive rights also being taken away from women. These are the issues that we're putting forward as we mark 25 years of Beijing. This is what we say is the homework of generation equality. It's all yours, Zozi.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Zozi, I mean, basically she's unburdening herself and saying, please take over. We've come so far. We haven't perhaps achieved everything we wanted to. Over to you, Zozibini.
Sorry?
Over to you. You have to take it on. How do you feel about such a big responsibility?
Yeah. You know, she is. She's absolutely right. Like I said, we're all here because of people who came before us and people who have done their part. And so it is our responsibility to pick it up and make sure that these things truly are implemented. It's huge. Like you said, it's a very, very big burden. But, you know, we are, you know, the future. Young people are the future, and we have to start taking these things as seriously as possible. So I hope I speak on behalf of us when I say, you know, we are ready to be the generation that will do that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm delighted that I managed to get both of you at the same time. Thank you so much for speaking with us here on SABC News.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sherwin, and hope to see you both soon.
Thank you, Executive Director. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka is a United Nations Under-Secretary General and the Executive Director of UN Women, and Zozibini Tunzi, the reigning Miss Universe, in conversation about National Women's Day in South Africa.
Thank you.
I still maintain that Sherwin Bryce-Pease is very lucky, but that message coming out there, no bystanders. There should be no bystanders when it comes to the issue of gender-based violence and also the issue around the emancipation of women. Every single way, whether we speak about women in your household, whether we speak about women in your circles, whether we speak about women abroad, everywhere. Let's make sure that there are no bystanders when it comes to this issue of GBV. When we come back, we look at the situation in Zimbabwe and also the 17 WHO experts who arrive in the country this evening.